Good morning and welcome everyone to the virtual Aon Insights Series 2020 Industry Day. It is expected that between 50 and 60% of thermal power stations will be closed by 2040, with an energy generation mix in place that is dominated by dispatchable renewable energy. This will deliver reliable and affordable electricity, as well as drive an increase in Australia's economic welfare. It is estimated this transition will add up to 13 billion to the GDP and enable increased spending by Australians of over 6 billion. Australia's energy system is undergoing the biggest change since electricity became widely available more than a century ago. This is because Australians are changing the way we use energy, and we're embracing new technologies such as solar, wind, and more recently, battery storage. Renewable energy is no longer an option, but the future. The transition is not to be feared, but it must be managed. As we enter and navigate volatile insurance market conditions, both here in Australia and globally, a client having the ability to demonstrate a mature and thoughtful approach to risk management has never been more important. For the next 45 minutes, I'll be joined by two of the market sector's leading underwriters. We have for you today, from Liberty Specialty Markets, Sarah Suarez. Sarah is the National Manager for Energy and Power and has over 10 years of experience in both the London and local power market. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Dom, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. Hoping it's insightful to all here today.
Good. And from Berkshire Hathaway Specialty Insurance, we have Fraser Logan. Fraser is Berkshire's lead power underwriter and has over 10 years experience in the industry. Welcome, Fraser.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Great to be here to share my thoughts, and it's exciting to see people's interest in the industry. So look forward to today.
Great. So for more detail on today's speakers, please refer to the bios available on this page. To kick off, so this morning we've prepared some questions for the panel that will be focusing what our clients should consider from a risk perspective throughout the life cycle of an asset. I would like to encourage our audience to submit any questions they may have throughout, and we will aim to address as many as we can towards the end of the session. So let's kick things off then, guys. Australia is blessed with endless sunlight and wind, making it an extremely attractive proposition for long-term investment into renewable energy development. Whilst there are many competing factors during the site selection phase of a project, for example, connection availability, today I would like to focus specifically on natural catastrophe perils. When developers or any stakeholders are considering the location and site for their project, understanding what they need to consider from a risk perspective to secure the best insurance outcome is incredibly important. Sarah, I will come to you first this morning. Could you provide the audience with some background as to the modelling that is used to evaluate natural catastrophe exposures, please?
Certainly. So the physical nature and characteristics of solar and wind projects mean that they can be quite exposed to obviously Mother Nature. And to understand or evaluate this, us insurers, the market uses several natural catastrophe models to help quantify the potential loss exposure at particular locations. But in addition to these models, we actually also use and assess and analyze independent studies that sometimes can form part of insurance submissions and is always a benefit. From our perspective, obviously, the more detailed and better quality of information that we do receive on the perils affecting a specific site, the better the insurance outcome, obviously, for our clients. And as insurers will always have a better grasp this way of the risk exposure, and will be able to fairly rate for these rather than perhaps erring on the side of caution or even just being conservative. Ultimately, at the end of the day, pricing a project will be directly impacted by the results produced by these models, and they will also inform other terms and conditions such as sublimits or even deductibles. So for wind and solar projects in Australia, we predominantly use wind and flood models, or we predominantly focus, on wind and flood perils. But the threat of hail and bushfire is certainly an ever-increasing concern, and one which insurers across the industry do assess in detail.
Thanks, Sarah. So let's take a dive into, I guess, each of the perils you've just mentioned, and maybe Fraser, you can kick us off with the peril of flood, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. So, flood can be a significant exposure in Australia, particularly to assets that are located on flat land near natural watercourses, which is inevitably the case with PV solar farms. As Sarah said, as insurers, we have detailed models which predict the natural perils, including flood. And as such, when we're reviewing a risk, we want to be confident that the project has adequately assessed and mitigated the potential exposures that we as insurers see. The only way that we can do this is really through the supply of detailed information specific for the project as part of that insurance submission. Firstly, this is how have the flood levels been accurately predicted, whether it's through hydraulic modelling, just flood studies, or even the use of local council flood mapping. And this should be both for the static flood levels as well as any chance of having a flow of flood waters through the site. Also, particularly with the hydrological reports, if flood mitigation works have been proposed in the report, we'd like to make clear which of, if any of these have been taken up. Then it's through to sort of the site layout and elevation diagrams. And this is where the insurers and our engineers gain understanding how the design has been adjusted to eliminate or to mitigate the flood exposures. Has equipment been located away from flood-prone areas? And has all the susceptible equipment been located at an adequate height above the 100, the 1 in 100 flood level? So ultimately, these are the fundamentals of designing a solar farm, but we need to see these come through in the submissions so that we've got confidence that they have been addressed. There are also, obviously, exposures in the construction phase of any project, and particularly, again, in solar. And this ranges from the storing of equipment during the construction, both off-site storage before being brought to site and while it's on site, or even when it's been placed in the field just awaiting installation. Are any of these areas exposed to flood? Also, scheduling flood-exposed work such as roads or large foundations or even trenching, trying to schedule those away from flood-prone times or rainy seasons. And then it's also potentially prioritising work that is in flood zones. This means that if they are delayed, there is an opportunity to make good without having to delay the entire schedule of the project. And finally, we also like to see that how access of the site will be maintained during any flood event. Are there alternate routes? How critical is accessing the site during these periods going to be? So that's a bit of an idea of the areas that we look at, Dom.
Thanks, Fraser, for that detailed answer on flood. That's great. So, Sarah, there are a number of projects both operating and with development approval granted in the far north Queensland region. This area of Australia is windstorm exposed, as most of the audience will know. So it'd be great if you could comment further on this peril, please.
Sure. So perhaps I'll break this down and address solar or, exposure to solar farms first. So while we'll discuss technology specifics later, it'll be no surprise to anyone that solar farms can be quite sensitive to wind. And the way that panels respond to wind is quite varied, and this can change significantly depending on the type of solar design. So while the insurance industry at times does derive comfort from sites being code, this doesn't translate as well to solar farms, I'm afraid. So solar farms in Australia might be classified under the National Construction Code to be of importance level 1 because of their low degree of hazard to life. But essentially, so solar farms could be lumped in with, say, sheds, where the design return periods are substantially reduced. from an insurance perspective, then, advising us that the site is built to code and therefore robust when it comes to wind exposure, I think everyone will agree, this isn't typically enough. The same applies to some international codes as well, such as the American Society of Civil Engineers, which is essentially set up to ensure the strong design of a rigid building. But it's just not intended for a flexible solar panel structure. So at the end of the day, without appropriate modeling, such as perhaps dynamic wind tunnel testing, it's impossible to predict how panels or trackers, for example, will fare in different wind conditions, even in regions, Dom, that aren't considered highly wind exposed, such as far north Queensland, which you mentioned. So at the end of the day, it's no surprise that the insurance industry is very keen to receive the results of these tests, of these dynamic wind tunnel tests, etc. So as far as wind projects, so I'll move on to wind farms now, as far as they're concerned, now, they're going to be located where the wind blows. I guess, after all, that's the point of wind turbines. But what we as underwriters are going to be focusing on here then is understanding whether the turbines selected for a project are built to withstand the expected wind speeds and the wind conditions at that specific site, and whether ultimately that they are fitted with robust wind protection systems.
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess recently what we've seen in the industry, hail is certainly topical. And we've seen an increase in the number of hail losses globally over recent years. And I understand it can be a bit more difficult to measure the exposure of hail at a site location and can be subjective from each insurer to the next. Fraser, would you agree with this?
Yeah, John, generally, yes. So obviously, hail has a reputation in the insurance industry, mainly for roof and automobile damage, but it is obviously seen as a real exposure to PV solar farms. The good old Google search will bring up a few horror photos of a PV panel after a hailstorm. And to be honest, hail modelling in the past has been focused more on the frequency of storms rather than to do with the intensity or the hail size. And this has meant, there's quite a bit of uncertainty around the sort of the vulnerability or the damageability of these assets. There's many examples. Again, the good old Google photos show this of two sets of panels side by side, one damaged horribly and one without a scratch. So if a project is located in a hail zone, there's always going to be greater scrutiny around the hail and also potentially some limits in the cover that gets offered. Currently, obviously there's limited mitigation mitigation measures that can be put in place. Nobody's keen to put a sailcloth over the top of their solar farm, and so really we have to go back to the fundamentals to address whether it's going to be successful or hail. So at the moment, the fundamentals or the benchmark that we're looking for is obviously compliance with the IE standard 61215, and this is really to say that the panels are resilient to being struck by a hail ball about the size of a golf ball, travelling at 23 metres per second. And this is really a requirement of all Tier 1 suppliers, so it is common across the industry, but having documented certification that this has been achieved is important when it comes to insurance. Where you do have trackers installed, we're also looking for either formalised or automatic stowing protocols. This means when hailstorm conditions are coming, that the panels are driven into a more vertical position, and this is to hope that any strikes are more sort of oblique or a glancing blow, and that means that there isn't any much potential for damage on the panels. So that's what we're looking for at the moment.
Thanks, Fraser. So moving on, I mean, while the world is still coming to terms with the devastation of the bushfires early this year, both in Australia and in California, sadly it seems our new reality is that bushfires will happen more frequently and will be felt more severely than in the past. Sarah, can you give us your thoughts on this statement, please?
Sure. Look, Dom, not wanting to take away from the incredible devastation that were the bushfires in January or December and January of this year. But remarkably, actually, quite few losses came from or affected, say, wind and solar assets, actually, here in Australia. However, that said, that wasn't the case at all in California, where, with the recent wildfires over there, where quite a number of solar farms were actually affected. So, the industry is seeing tremendous losses relating to bushfires, and they're creeping in around solar especially. And to that end, we are relying more on modelling, and insurers want to ensure that owners and developers show a strong commitment to mitigation and planning, for disaster, more so than us just relying on models. We're really focused, what there to mitigation and planning, disaster planning. So the key information I guess we want to get out of, and we want to understand from our insureds is, what vegetation management and control practices are they carrying, and whether those plans factor in not only, say, controlling the height of grass on site with say, specialist mowers, but are they also accounting for vegetation density? And does this design of the solar farm consider that into is it designed into it? So, a lot of these sites can be fairly remote, which then talks to whether, for us, the concern is whether a site is manned or unmanned. So a manned site is always preferred over an unmanned site, because, as you know, bushfires can obviously spread very quickly and time will be of the essence. A manned site, you're able to control or contain a bushfire. The probability is much higher of containing one than a remote unmanned site, which obviously has very little chance of holding back a fire. As regards wind farms, the industry still hasn't seen very many losses coming through from bushfires yet. But that said, we do use modelling that considers this risk, and especially in heavily forested areas, we want to understand the risk and make sure that it's actually been evaluated by project developers and owners, and again, that mitigations have been put in place.
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess given everything we've discussed around those perils, Fraser, could you give the audience a flavour of some of the claims that you've seen in the industry, maybe over the past 2 or 3 years, resulting from natural catastrophe events?
Yeah, sure, Don. Obviously, as insurers, we're there to play claims, and actually we sort of view this as our product. And when we talk about our experience with claims, it's to share the very real scenarios across the globe that provide real losses, but they also provide context to the many questions that we ask when we're looking at a project. When it comes to the claims in the renewable sector, NatCat is well represented, and reportedly up to 80% of the value of claims in the renewables has been associated with natural perils, so particularly windstorm and hail. In Australia, as Sarah says, we're yet to see catastrophic total losses of operational assets associated with natural perils, but overseas there's been cyclones in Puerto Rico, hail in Texas, and again, as Sarah just said, the bushfires in California, and these have led to significant claims. This said, in Australia, the assets have seemed to be more exposed during the construction phases, and that's led to a lot of the losses that we've seen here in the Australian market. To sort of move quickly through them, some of them are high wind events, again, particularly during the construction, which has led to damage of both the panels and the tracking systems. So this is when the tracking systems have not been energised and have been unable to stow when the wind storm has hit, and this has really caused the panels being able to move and flex in the wind and caused a lot of damage. Particularly of interest is, again, this is supposedly non-exposed regions where these occurred. And it's highlighted a couple of aspects. Firstly, so the shortfall in some of these tracker designs, but also the complexity of assessing damage in the event of one of these losses, and also the massive delays from an event, as well as all the remedial works to return the plant back to operational status. And this can have a huge impact on a project and its ability to come to market. Other losses we've seen is associated with flash flooding, not only sort of eroding roads and underscoring foundations, but also, as I alluded to before, about damaging panels that have been stockpiled ready to be installed. Other ones of the wind assets is lightning strikes is something that we've seen. Obviously, the lightning strikes have been more frequent and caused more damage to blades. On this particular example, it highlighted a shortfall in the design of the lightning protection system, which the manufacturers had to retrospectively repair globally, but it has been a real impact on the project schedule to accommodate that sort of delay. Also, another interesting one has been sort of alludes to the vegetation management as well, is DC cable failures. So this is both connectors as well as operating in hot conditions, has seen DC cable fails, and this then falling onto vegetation, as Sarah just told us about, can lead to sort of self-generated fires on the sites. And also another interesting one is the wet and humid conditions. This could sort of test the IP rating of some of the equipment that is installed, and we've seen this lead to equipment failures as well. So I think the takeaway I've grasped from all this is really when equipment is being selected, ensuring that the typical off-the-shelf models or solutions can withstand the conditions that are at your site.
Thanks, Fraser, and that's obviously positive for the audience. So I guess, look, for me, in conclusion, this really highlights the importance for any developer in addressing these natural catastrophe exposures as early in the project life cycle as possible. I mean, this will help ensure the design is reviewed early on from an insurance perspective, so that any necessary changes can be made without preventing the successful financial close of a project. So moving on now into the technology side of renewables, which is obviously moving at some pace. I mean, we've seen a boom in the renewable energy construction over the last 4 years, with almost 8,000 megawatts of new capacity added and a further 8,000 megawatts committed. As such, there has been exponential growth in the size of wind turbines entering the market. Gone are the days of the 0.5 to 2 megawatt units. Particularly in Australia, the move to 4 and 5+ megawatt turbines seems to be common practice for new projects. The speed of innovation in wind turbine technology has meant it is a regular occurrence for turbine manufacturers to release new models. Whilst this is a great achievement for the industry as a whole, it has meant some projects are now coming to the market with unproven and in many cases uncertified turbines. Fraser, maybe I'll come to you on this one. So how are insurers approaching this rapid rate of change?
I guess, yeah, look, Dom, as an engineer, I'm excited by these turbines, the technical challenges that they offer and ultimately the output and the efficiencies that they are providing to developers. But insurance-wise, the rate of change does provide some challenges. Historically, technical development of equipment such as gas turbines, steam turbines, was rather incremental, and this had allowed insurers to develop detailed technical knowledge of all the units in-house and the equipment, their operating status, and any known issues or developing issues. And this was sort of captured in the use of databases where you had a strong category of proven or unproven technology, and there was sort of accepted terms and conditions based off the status. Now, as we've just said, the nature of renewables and its rapid development has meant that insurers have had to move away from this rigid view on technology into a more flexible approach. But to be flexible, this needs to be supported by technical information and dialogue with developers as well as the original equipment manufacturers on this equipment. So sort of the key things that we like to see happen is firstly, technical presentations to the market. This showing the development of the equipment, showing if it has evolved from, in the case of wind turbines, from an existing proven platform, or is it a new revolutionary design. These presentations also give a chance for engineers, the insurers' engineers, to ask questions directly to the OEMs and build confidence about the equipment. There's also greater reliance on the type certification. Without units reaching significant operating hours elsewhere, we rely on the certification to prove that equipment performs as it is designed. And ultimately, there is more restrictive cover will be offered on uncertified equipment, and certification is a must before any of these assets enter operational. Also, we look for is this clear explanation of any emerging or technical issues, both on the project level as well as globally. And finally, insurers would like to see OEMs have confidence in their equipment and provide strong warranty conditions that limit the insurer's exposure to this developmental equipment. And then, ultimately, larger turbines we do see as they have the potential for larger claims, but we think through these processes that we can gain a lot more confidence and certainty around their performance.
Thanks, Fraser. So perhaps I'll move over to Sarah now. So whilst maybe not at the same speed as wind, the solar industry is certainly advancing when it comes to the technology being deployed at sort of utility scale, ground-mounted solar farms. Through your claims experience, do you have a preference in sort of certain designs over others?
Well, thanks, Don. Well, while turbines, as you've highlighted, have certainly become ever larger and, have dominated headlines in the news because of that, there have been, technology in the solar space as well. But, specifically as regarding photovoltaic technology, which is what we're sort of predominantly focusing on today, as I'll probably focus on that technology first or only really today, because that's the majority. Photovoltaic is really dominating at this stage the landscape in Australia. So as Fraser mentioned earlier, insurers have had to step away from those more traditional thought processes of classifying technology as whether, into two buckets, either proven or unproven. But we've had to find, and we have found, ways to be flexible, and we've been dynamic to match that rate of change and to support ultimately the industry. A fairly recent evolution in the solar space is the introduction of bifacials, which obviously you and I have spoken about quite a few times over the last few months. So rather than that one single-sided panel, because Australia is so blessed with, stronger radiance and reflected sunlight can or is enough, I suppose, to warrant panels on the underside of these structures. While we're very comfortable with the one sort of sided traditional panels, we have managed over time to get comfortable with the bifacial variation, so long as they conform, with relevant standards. The one that Fraser mentioned earlier, the IEC 61215, is one that we frequently look to get some of the comfort that we need for these bifacials. So even though they've actually only been recently developed, they're definitely starting to become more high profile in the market, and we only expect that to continue and for them to dominate soon. But I'm sure that the next technological advancement as regards panels is definitely just around the corner. Another key element, I suppose, of solar farms are whether they're designed on fixed tilt or axis tracking systems. As not surprisingly, insurers do or are very comfortable with fixed tilt systems, right? So as the name suggests, a fixed tilt system is typically fixed across multiple points. So from our perspective, that means that they're generally more robust as compared to axis tracking, which are typically only secure to, say, the one single torque tube. And ultimately might display torsional vibration issues, which can lead to a whole heap of different issues for us or for the industry, really. So that said, from the economics of a project, access tracking systems do dominate the industry, and due to the number of years it's been in the market and that it's been around globally as well, insurers do understand the risks associated with them, and we are quite comfortable with it. I think, based on the examples that sort of Fraser also mentioned earlier in his NatCat sort of losses or claims scenarios, I guess the main area of focus that has caused some issues for the market is the selection of robust tracking systems. So we've observed that manufacturers that are most successful in the sort of tracking space are those that have substantially invested in dynamic wind response studies, as I mentioned earlier, in the talk. But so they're able to design out the way that the panels will behave in sort of different conditions. And as a result, these manufacturers also include in their design or design of the facilities items such as dampers or offset tubing to ensure that panels respond in a more predictable and favorable way when the wind does pick up. So while I suppose, I guess Fraser would agree, we as insurers, we don't endorse a particular tracker manufacturer over another, but we do actively query their involvement in advanced wind response studies. So we are quite particular requesting these results for each specific project, because ultimately we can't really understand what we're exposed to and what that site is exposed to if we don't receive these. I suppose, as just as an example, claims example, given that you requested that, we have seen a significant loss to a solar farm caused by strong winds, interestingly enough, in a non-wind exposed region, or one which, we don't model for, or models suggest that there is no, wind exposure. And the proximate cause of that was exactly the inadequate design of the tracking system. So the thing that made it even more apparent, I suppose, was that, neighboring solar farms were completely unaffected by the wind event. And the main differences were that they had a bit more sort of robust design in them, but especially the trackers that were used were manufactured by, I suppose, reputed manufacturers, right? At the end of the day, that solar farm actually had to be completely redesigned. And I guess everyone here today will agree that retrofitting or redesigning any plant is extremely costly, right? And definitely not the ideal scenario for any stakeholder involved in any of these projects.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Fraser. I mean, they're great insights across both sectors, and obviously that they're moving at different paces, but certainly moving. I mean, from my personal experience, insurers today are certainly invested in growing at the same pace as the industry. And I guess the message for everyone in the audience today is that new technology is insurable, but insurers are not there to step in for research and design risk, which should naturally fall with the manufacturer themselves. So that's a positive message for all today. I guess, so moving on now, I mean, wind and solar PV projects, they can be designed with multiple single points of failure, which can negatively impact the generation revenue of a project over the course of its life. So what should our clients consider when evaluating redundancy in the design and selection of the site? I'll come to you first, Fraser, to discuss the effect of single points of failure on a project.
Thanks, Tom. This is a bit of an interesting one. I guess insurers view resilience of a plant as a strong indicator of the overall quality of the risk and the ability to operate through an incident or to quickly return to service following it. We see has got clear benefits both to the project and its reputation, but also to us insurers. Not only does it lessen the potential loss, but it also allows sites, their management teams and their staff to return to business as usual much quicker and get back to doing what they do well straight away, much faster. One of the appealing aspects of renewables is the inherent redundancy by their configuration. You've got millions of solar panels, hundreds of inverters, and even dozens of wind turbines. And with one unit being able to be taken out of service for inspection or maintenance, and this has very little impact on the plant's production or output. But this resilience is diminished when a single point of failure is introduced. And this can take out the whole generating capacity of the plant, but particularly for a long time if it's a long lead item, such as in the balancer plant, reactive plant, or even the transmission connection. And having a plant out of operation for 12 to 13 months has much more impact than just the financials, particularly to the workforce and subcontractors who may be stood down over this period, and the same level of experience and qualification, or qualified personnel might be available when you look to return to service. We understand that there's strong economic drivers to deliver a project with the lowest capital cost, and this leads to simplicity in the design. But we believe that taking a total project life cost approach, when considering redundancy, embedded redundancy, as it is thought, this delivers a better outcome for the project as a whole over its operational life.
Thanks, Fraser. And you've alluded there to obviously the effect of single points of failure. So I might move now to Sarah to tell us what sort of solutions for the audience today, from a redundancy perspective, are available to manage this risk.
Sure. I guess the most obvious one, as Fraser mentioned, is the potential for very long downtimes associated with transformer outages, which obviously make it seem sensible that mitigation measures are to have more than one step-up transformer for a project. This will obviously help reduce the impact to generation revenue if one of the transformers suffers an outage. But if these dual transformers are used, it's perhaps best if it is best if they're able to route the majority of the output from one of those, rather than just instead of only 50%, say, plant output. That would really be the optimum scenario. So if you do select a dual transformer design, it's key, however, that, they are installed with enough separation between them, as well as firewalling to prevent, quick escalation of a fire, for example. Without these adequate protection in places, it's almost irrelevant and just an expensive exercise to have the two. I suppose another point is switch rooms. So while it would be nice to have 2 switch rooms for every project, the reality is that this just hasn't caught on in the industry. And while it's quicker to repair switch rooms than transformers, they're still quite tricky repairs to carry out. So insurers, when assessing the risk of these, is whether robust fire protection and mitigation measures have been incorporated into the design of these items. So while it is fairly straightforward, actually, to fit them with fire and smoke detection and even gas suppression systems. And these systems will help prevent damage from occurring in the first place, right? Which is what everybody would prefer to see happen. Lastly, I guess I should touch on spares. At the end of the day, while a comprehensive spares list is viewed positively, there's more to spares than just owning them, right? So it's important that developers or owners have thought through things like, where are these spares located? Let's say, are they on site? Are they in Australia but off-site, or are they abroad? How easy is it to transport that equipment, and have access routes and roads to the site been maintained, or will time and money actually need to be spent on them before the spares can even arrive there, right? Before they can even arrive at site. So depending on the item in question, actually, specialist equipment might be required for the repair or replacement of a unit. An obvious example being specialist cranes for large wind turbines. I guess, a key question is, have owners considered the availability of such cranes? Currently, there are only a few cranes in Australia, and it will be sod's law, that when your unit fails, it's not going to be available and for quite a while, right? So I guess, you need to have the necessary discussions with the OEMs, and you need to ask or just ensure that there are contractual provisions in your contracts with these OEMs to ensure the availability of specialized cranes, at least through the warranty periods. And, finally, I guess, it's important that you consider where your spares are being stored. Are you ensuring that they're adequately protected from environmental threats, and so that they are available when you need them? At the end of the day, Dom, from an insurer's perspective, redundancy built into a project is always going to be viewed more favorably. It's going to work well for us, but ultimately the real benefit is to project owners.
Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, completely agree on that point. And I certainly feel that the developers that we're taking this into consideration more now, maybe than previously years, which is great. So I guess moving on, over the past few years, the renewable sector has seen an increase in claims activity. And Fraser has already alluded to some of those incidents caused by natural catastrophe events. Recently, EPC contractors have departed the Australian renewable industry, and incidents disrupting project progress, such as workmanship and general errors, have been seen on a number of occasions. This has meant there has been an increased focus from insurers on understanding who has been contracted to build these assets. So, Sarah, maybe you can just talk us through a single example of a workmanship claim that you have seen, please.
Sure. Like you said, it's no secret that in the last few years there have been several workmanship claims in Australia. On wind farms, for example, locking pins which hold the drivetrain and hub in a positive mechanical lock allow for a blade to be installed. And to install the second and third blade, the first and then second need to be rotated. But prior to rotating that hub to allow for this, the locking pins have to be removed. Otherwise, significant damage, such as, say, cracking of the nacelle bed frame, can occur. This does seem like a fairly simple task, but some of the locking pins can be really difficult to get to. And we, unfortunately, have seen this type of claim a fair number of times now affect the industry. We've also seen poor practices in HV cable laying, which has actually generated losses across multiple sites as they were being, as these different sites were using the same contractor. We've seen poor loading, unloading, and transportation of heavy equipment, leading to a number of handling and impact losses, such as impacts on blades during road transport or by careless crane management when fitting blades, or dare I say, clumsy handling of heavy but delicate inverter packages. As an industry, we've always focused on contractor and subcontractor experience. However, the loss experience affecting renewable energy has really meant that insurers have increased, scrutiny over this. And we don't only look at, I guess the main point I want to make is we don't only look at the developer or contractor company name, even when the name may be with loads of experience. What we want to understand is that the experience of the local Australian team, the people on the ground, to ensure that those guys, those teams on the ground that are performing the work understand Australian conditions, but also have the necessary training and capabilities to manage such projects. So we're not necessarily being hit with highly technical workmanship claims, but even relatively straightforward incidents, replicated across multiple sites and at the scale of these, plants can generate high value losses for the industry.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to make a call. We had two questions that I wanted to run through. One is supply chains and one is around warranties. And I think between the two, I'm going to make the call that we move to the operational side of things, as I know supply chains and COVID is topical, but personal experience, I haven't seen too much effect in supply chains from COVID to date. So I think we'll move past that for now, and we'll dive straight into basically what is the insurance industry's view on sort of wind and solar assets that have either come out of warranty or in the late plant life stage. So perhaps, Fraser, you could shed some light on this topic, please.
Thanks, Dom. I guess ultimately, insurers are comfortable with equipment as it comes out of its warranty period. The hope is that the equipment has gone through its initial teething phase on the famous bathtub curve and has entered the reliable operating phase, and with no ongoing or underlying issues as these warranties expire. At this stage, these assets generally run well without too many equipment failures. However, obviously, as the equipment gets to the back end of its design life, we usually see that increase in failure rates again. The more comprehensive nature of the operation and maintenance contracts now being agreed to means that the OEMs or the EPC contractors continue to be involved, and they're often incentivised to address emerging issues promptly and proactively. This is seen as a real positive by insurers, but ultimately we are still exposed to generating revenue losses, even if the PD stuff is the property damage is covered through the contract. We look to address these issues quickly, but obviously with the design life of these assets being pretty short compared to their thermal ancestors, we seem to go through the happy operating phase quite quickly. We get to the end of life issues quickly, and that means that we have to consider obsolescence. And there we look for the customers to be across their technology, familiar with what equipment is no longer being manufactured or supported by the OEMs, and look at alternate asset management strategies in these situations to try to address the exposure, whether this is through greater spare holdings, looking at second-hand equipment, or potentially looking at aftermarket spares. And I guess the final part of this sort of end-of-life approach is also just as a business continuity planning part is to consider what would we do if we did have a significant loss at the site. Would we look to replace the units with a new modern unit, which could potentially be an orphan, not the same as the rest? Do we look at replacing it with a second hand, or do we, not replace the unit at all and particularly just, wait for the repowering of the site, which only might be a few years away? So these are the options that we want. If the customers have considered this, we want that to be clearly come across in the insurance submission, so we know what sort of cover they're looking for.
And look, I'm being told we've run out of time, and we've got a number of questions that have come in from the audience, which is great. So I'll happily, if you can email me, I'll happily get in touch directly. One question I do want to address, and I don't think it's a renewable energy Q&A if you don't touch on battery. So I know with battery storage opportunities increasing in Australia and the drive towards dispatchable renewable energy growing, just maybe if one of you can just touch on quickly what the main concerns around this technology are, and then we'll look to close out. So either of you, Fraser, Sarah?
I'll step in. Look, obviously batteries, it's an emerging technology, and it's going to be, perform an important role in the network stability, supplying on-demand power. But ultimately, at this stage, we have seen a lot of loss activity overseas, potentially, over 40 equipment failures overseas in the last 3 years, which is quite frequent. And I guess what we appreciate that the technology is being addressed. They're looking at how to contain thermal runaway, detect it early, and so on. But really, we have to go back to the fundamentals of fire separation and limiting the loss exposure to get our confidence. So obviously, first starts off with good equipment, non-manufacturers with proven technology is what we're looking for. And then, as I said, sort of physical separation, splitting the plant up into multiple areas to prevent the chance of the whole plant being taken out in one loss. Fire barriers, limiting the continuity of combustible materials, and then also looking at the accessibility and the ability to fight fires in these buildings. So, firstly, detection and suppression, but also, how do you make it safe for the emergency services to come into these plants? Without these types of controls, as insurers, we are going to be cautious, and we might view the assets as a potential to be completely lost in a single event, which doesn't really come out as a good insurance solution for the customer.
Dom, and I know you've sort of run out of time, but I'd like just to make the one final point, because I think it's really interesting, and I think that, you know, the audience here will appreciate it. I recently attended a presentation by DNVGL. You know, they're an independent risk management and design certification body, and they actually made a comment that, you know, you can assume and expect that at least one fire in your battery operation that will happen in the life of a project. And I think, you know, that's astounding, really. So stopping a fire from spreading is therefore, you know, top priority, and research centers in the US are actually spending a lot of time on this. For example, the NFPA and UL. But, you know, to make it worse, because of the energy stored in batteries, you know, as Fraser mentioned, traditional gas suppression systems aren't effective. So underwriters are looking for a great deal of reassurance around any operations fire mitigation strategies, right? So spacing and real scale fire tests are really important, Dom.
Thanks, Sarah, and this is probably evidence to the audience that when I start talking renewables with both Sarah and Fraser, it never finishes as planned. So, I guess closing point and to conclude today's session. Obviously, we'd just like to thank Sarah and Fraser for openly sharing with the audience their experiences in the sector, good and bad, and providing some great insights and solutions that will hopefully prove valuable to the audience today. I mean, we're all aware that it's a challenging market that we're facing, but the speed of growth in renewables is here. It's here to stay. So how we can sort of generate the confidence of the likes of Fraser and Sarah going forward in the insurance space is obviously critical. So look, thank you all for joining again. Thanks Sarah and Fraser, and I'll be in touch with those questions and answers directly. But thanks all for joining today.
Thank you very much,
Thanks, Dom. Appreciate it.